So what happened was I said to her, look, you have a family history and it's an interesting story. The problem is that you're going to sell 75 books and that's it. So do you really want to go to all this trouble for 75 books? I said, it's your relatives and your friends are going to buy the book and that's going to be the end of it. You'll have to find a vanity publisher, which you'll have to pay to get this thing published. I said, or I could take aspects of your story and I could turn it into a novel. So she said, let me speak to my parents. So her parents were both, her mother's still alive. Her father passed away in September. He passed away, unfortunately, Yom Kippur. And she calls me back a few days later. She says, yeah, my parents would be interested in talking to you. So I go down to Brooklyn and I meet her at her parents' house. And I fell instantly in love with her parents. So why did I fall in love with them? Because even though my parents were born in the Bronx and her parents were born in Havana, they're from the same time. So it was like talking to my parents. And I started to learn about what life was like for the Jewish community in Cuba. And I started to understand their story, their particular story, and how their family was involved in the revolution and how it affected them. And I said to them, you have some very, very interesting stuff here. And how would you feel about me using it in a novel? And they were fine with it. And that's how the book was born.
Okay. And did you end up going to Cuba to do research?
No. So that is an interesting problem. So it's very, very hard to go to Cuba these days. But the truth of the matter is that the Cuba I would find today is not the Cuba that existed in 1958, 1959, and 1962 when they were there. So there was no urgent need for me to go to Cuba, in addition to which it's very difficult to go to Cuba. There was this short period of time when you could go to Cuba. Obama tried to open things up a little, but because Obama tried to open things up a little, the minute that Trump entered the White House, he had to close it up. So it's very, very difficult. But I sort of contemplated to myself, am I really the right guy to write the story? So I was having lunch with a friend of mine who's Dominican, and he's an interesting guy. He's like he's kind of the mayor of Washington Heights. And I was telling him about the story, and I said to him, the question is, do I have the chops to write this book? He says to me, of course you have the chops to write this book. You live at the intersection of Latino and Jewish. So, you could do this. And what's interesting is that as I interviewed 28 people who were either refugees themselves or the children of refugees, what I came to understand was that Cuba, well, it's not the Dominican Republic. In many ways, they're very, very similar, so that I could understand sort of the place well enough to be able to write about it. So when this really came to me it was the second or third time. Can I have that book for a second?
Yes.
It was the second or third time that I went out to visit with her parents, and we were talking over lunch, bagels and lox. Afterwards, always coffee. It's a lot of coffee. I mean, it's unbelievable. I just got back from Buenos Aires, and I don't know what it is about the Spanish world, but I love the Spanish world. Everywhere you go in these countries, there's coffee and cake. And they're all like this. The entire population, you see a fat person, but every 3 feet there's coffee and cake. So I don't really understand this. So yeah, there was endless coffee and endless cake. So I said to Paula Bradman, that's Miriam's mother, and she's the basis for the Beatrice character. I said to her, what was it like when you got here? We gotta get rid of this. Oh, okay. So I said to her, what was it like when you got here? And she says to me, in this delightful Cuban accent, it was like a cemetery. So they arrived in January, and they had gone from Cuba to Miami, and then they went from Miami to New York, but in January. So they had never experienced the cold, and she said to me, it looked like it was just gray and white. It looked like a cemetery, and I immediately understood that. Now I should mention to you that I'm going to read you a very, very brief passage here. This was originally the opening paragraph of the book, but because of the structure of the book, I had to move it to the section 4. Okay. And this is when I knew that I understood the world they were coming from. Though the day was warm, the light was the same as that January day some 40 years earlier when Aaron and Beatrice arrived in New York City, stark, gray-white cold like a cemetery. Far from the colors of Cuba, deep and alive, vibrant green, lipstick red, azure like the tropical sea, burnt orange, turquoise, and lemon yellow. There the air was filled with palpitating music, the sounds of children laughing and mothers calling. Havana tickled the nose with the scent of garlic, sizzling in fragrant olive oil. One's skin tingled with the momentary rush of raindrops caressing as through a gauzy veil. Havana was a kaleidoscope, always moving, changing. New York, a black and white photo, even in summer, inured to the senses. So once I knew that I understood the place, I felt confident that I could write the story, even if I could not physically visit it. What I did was a huge amount of research, and I looked at literally, 1,000 photographs of old Havana and old Cuba, and I read accounts online of people's lives there, and I interviewed people here, and eventually, it came together. Now, normally it takes me about 2 to 2.5 years from start to finish. From the day I sit down and start doing research till the day that the book comes out is 2 to 2.5 years. Because of the pandemic, this went on a lot longer because I, couldn't focus. So, but it did give me the time to do a lot of research to be able to really understand the place. And that's really the most significant thing here, because what is important to understand is that the story of Cuban Jewry is very unique. It's unlike any other story. Uniformly, every Cuban Jew I spoke to said the same thing to me. No anti-Semitism. The community, we talked a little about this earlier, the community really established itself in the first quarter of the 20th century. So you basically had 3 communities. You had Sephardi Jews who came from the Ottoman Empire. You had Ashkenazi Jews who came primarily from Poland. For whatever odd reason, the Lithuanians went to South Africa. And it's interesting because Miriam's husband is South African. So and then you had this third community of American Jews who came in the 1920s for business opportunities. And I had done, how many of you are on Facebook? Okay, so on Facebook, there's a page called Renee's Reading Club. Yeah. Yes, and you want to be on there pushing my books all the time. Okay, thank you. I'm going to be, actually, she's going to be interviewing me about this book on March 26th. So I met a woman there on that page who lives in Miami on my last book, The Interpreter. And it turns out her husband was born in Cuba. And he was of American parents who had gone to Cuba. They were from Brooklyn. And they went to Cuba to open up a department store. So that opened up a whole world to me of these people who I could, more people I could interview. So what's interesting about it is that you had this influx of Jews, and why did you have that? You had this influx of Jews primarily because of a change in the law in the United States relative to immigration. And around 1924, the immigration law was changed, and there was no more open immigration from Europe. Now, that affected Jewish immigration because if you lived in Poland, you had to fit into the Polish quota. There was no Jewish Polish quota. There was no Hungarian Jewish quota. You had to come in under the nation you lived in. So it severely restricted this. But really interestingly, there was no quota system for immigrants from Latin America, probably because there were no immigrants from Latin America at that time. So if you went to Cuba or Mexico or Argentina or any of these places, and you stayed there for however long, 2, 3, 4, 5 years until you could get citizenship, you could then come to the United States. You just apply for a visa and come to the United States. And they weren't asking any questions. So a lot of people used Havana, which used to be called Hotel Havana. All right, they used it as a way station before they came to the United States, but many of them stayed. So by 1958, had about 15,000 Jews, mostly in Havana, incredibly successful. They had 3 synagogues. They were all business people. They had 3 synagogues. They had their own beach club. They had a country club. And their children were attending university and becoming doctors and lawyers and bankers. So they were very well integrated into Cuban society. And when they would show me, I went to visit with, Juan and Paula, and they're showing me pictures from when they were kids. And I'm looking at these pictures. I mean, you look at the dresses, and these are the same dresses my mother and her cousins and girlfriends wore to go to, Sweet 16 parties. I mean, it's the same life. It's the same kind of social striving life that American Jews had in the 1940s and 50s in this country. So it was a really interesting place. And it's interesting because I did one of these programs at a synagogue out in Long Island, and a bunch of Cuban ladies came. And they were very sweet. And one of them, I'll dispense with, I won't imitate her accent, but she said to me that, whatever you had here, we had there. So you had cars, we had cars. You had TV, we had TV. Whatever it was, we had the same thing. So this was really a burgeoning community that was growing. People, American Jews, we tend not to think about this. We tend not to think that there's any place but the United States and maybe Israel. But the truth is that, there are very, very successful families, successful communities all over Europe, particularly in Latin America. And I have a cousin in Brazil. I have a lot of cousins in Brazil, actually. So from the Greenfield family, make a long story short, there was this one cousin, 1925, they can't come to the United States anymore. So this guy was my great-grandmother's brother. His name was Ben. And he sends his oldest son, gives him a steamship ticket. And, it's the typical picture of the guy. It's like that picture we have of Uncle Max and Aunt Uncle with the wool coats and the palm trees. Ridiculous. He's a big guy. He's like up to here. And, he's got this coat on and this hat. And he goes on this steamship. And he's going to Buenos Aires. But the first stop is Rio. And he gets off in Rio, and he sent a telegram to his father, says, no, we're staying here. I like it here. And so, over generations, I mean, they've been there since 1927. There's 100 or more of them, and they're business people. They've been very successful. And that's the thing we need to kind of understand is in terms of Cuba, that had Castro not come along, that community would have continued to grow. And it would be comparable, not in size, but certainly in its sort of nature and character to the Jewish communities in places like, Santiago in Chile, and Buenos Aires in Argentina, and Rio and Sao Paulo in Brazil. So there were some Jews who were communists. One of them was Miriam's uncle, whose real name was Solomon. In the book, he's Moses. And he believed in this. But what's really interesting about their story, and this was the thing that grabbed me, and I said, can't be, but it was that he was a communist, but his family didn't disown him for being a communist. They cut off all contact with him at this critical point because he married out. He got involved with a Cuban woman, a Gentile woman, who was also a communist. According to, several people that I interviewed, she kind of really turned him into a communist. She, because she was a really dedicated communist. And he married her secretly after his father told him he was to break it off. And after that, there was no contact. So it seems to me that if I was a factory owner, and this guy owned leather tanning factories and shoe manufacturing factories, if I'm a factory owner and the communists had just taken over the country and my son is in the government, I probably don't want to cut myself off from the son. But that's what happened.
Well, just building on that point, how much of that was true? Because when, not to get, I know most of you have read the book, but there's been a little.
So how many have read the book? Okay, great.
Yeah. So when Moises kind of has a big reveal at the very end, and he talks about how he gave up, Anna Teresa for his brother, like both, like there was a very strong sense of family, even though they were estranged from each other. But then he said, oh, I gave up Anna Teresa for you, but in fact, she was cheating on him, and she was not a particularly good wife.
No, she was a terrible
She
wife.
was a terrible wife, so
Oh.
I always thought like, well, what did you really give up? You ended up with this great woman afterwards. And so in some ways they betray, like there was always this sense in the book of people betraying either their country, their family, their cause. And then how did you reconcile that? Or how did you think about that as you were going through that?
So that really, in order for me to explain this to you, we have to take a step to the side and talk a little bit about historical fiction. So there's a big difference between history and historical fiction. So the story I like to tell about this, to start off, is about Herman Wouk. Okay, so Herman Wouk wrote a book called War and Remembrance a long time ago, because I was like a teenager when he wrote that book. And I'm not a teenager, anything near it. So in this book, he has this scene where it's, as we all know, September 1st of 1939 was when Hitler invaded Poland. So he sets this scene, and this character, who's a very important character, main character in the book, he's in a synagogue in Poland. It's the first day of Rosh Hashanah, and the bombs start dropping. Okay. Okay, it's a historical fact. So I said to myself, okay, well, Rosh Hashanah could fall on Labor Day, possible, right? It has happened. Okay, so I'm writing the interpreter, and I'm dealing with that specific day, September 1st, which is when the war starts, for real in Europe. And I don't know what possessed me to fact check. But you see, Herman Wouk, he could do this. AJ Sidransky can't do this. He changed the day. It turns out that Rosh Hashanah was 2 weeks later, but he needed it. Okay, so how does that relate to this? So I'm sitting in their house, and I'm interrogating them politely about, the details of their story. And I'm asking, well, how did you get out? Like what actually happened? And one who's our own starts telling me the story about how, he applied for visas. So, everything was a wink and a nod. They knew you weren't coming back, and they didn't really care because they didn't want any political sort of opposition whatsoever, even if it was just a lawyer who worked for the bank, National Bank of Cuba. They didn't want these people in the country. So the game was that you would apply for a visiting visa to leave the country and go for 2 weeks to someplace, and wink, wink, they knew you weren't coming back. And when you didn't come back, they would just simply impound everything in your apartment or home. So he goes and he gets the visas, and he goes to the airport, and Miriam is like 2 years old. So he gives the passports to the woman who was behind the desk, the immigration officer, and she says, well, there's a problem. What's that? Well, there's 3 of you, but there's only 2 visas. And he looks at her and says, 3 of us. She's 2 years old. I'm her father. I don't need a visa for her. Now you do. We make the rules. So that whole scene, for those of you who read it, Paula, oh, it's true. And Paula said to me, I nailed it. That when she read it, she was weeping because I really captured what happened to her on that day. So he knew, Juan knew he had to send her out because her passport was expiring and she could never get another. So he says, so you're gonna go and I'm gonna stay here with Miriam and I'll get the 2 of us out. So he then proceeds to tell me how he brings the kid, leaves the kid with his in-laws who lived in Havana. His parents didn't live in Havana, and they lived about an hour and a half, 2 hours outside of Havana in a place called I forgot, Red Light. So no, Matanzas. So he goes night after night, to stand online, and ultimately, he gets into an office of some, bureaucrat, and the guy says to him, are you Solomon Bradman's brother? And he says to me, And Juan sounded exactly like this with the car. And he says to me, I didn't know whether I should say yes or I should say no, but I went with the truth. Okay, so he said he's my brother. A guy says to him, come back tomorrow. And the next day he has the visas. So I said to Juan, I said, do you believe that Solomon, who they have not spoken to in 2 years or more, do you believe Solomon helped you to get the visas? And he refuses to answer. Now, this is where we get to the issue of historical fiction. So as a writer, I need a couple of things. I need what's called an inciting incident. And I need to be able to create certain tension for the reader. So what I needed here was a quid pro quo. So the Cuban Revolution happened. We all know that. But the incident at San Miguel, as I describe it, never happened. I made all that up. So why did I make that up? Because there had to be a reason why the Moisés character, Solomon, would feel he had to help his brother. So what's interesting is at one of these events, Miriam's mother came and I was saying exactly this to the audience, and she interrupted me and said, that didn't happen, but things like it did happen all the time. Which, brings me to sort of what I think is, for me, was one of the critical things that happened for me as a writer with this story, which is that I came to understand, because, I've written about fascism and I've written about communism, and I was with my son in Budapest. I took him to Hungary and the Czech Republic and Slovakia when he graduated law school, because I wanted to see where we came from. And we go to this place called the Museum of Terror, which is the brainchild of a certain Viktor Orban. So Viktor Orban is he's kind of the poster child for modern day fascism, sort of soft fascism. Yeah. There's not exactly jackboots, but you can kind of hear him in the background. And he wants to rewrite Hungarian history. And he wants people to believe that Hungary was neither fascist nor communist by nature, that in 1944, the Germans occupied Hungary and they imposed fascism on the Hungarians. And he wants you to believe that, there were no Hungarian communists, that the Soviets imposed the system on Hungary for 25 years. What I realized when we walked through this so-called museum, and I use the term loosely, is that while fascism and communism have diametrically opposed economic systems, in effect, they're the same system. They're the same political system. And it's important to kind of understand that, to understand what happened in Cuba, Venezuela, all kinds of places, in that there's no freedom of thought. There's no freedom of speech. There's no freedom of anything. You have to toe the mark. And if you don't, you end up in prison, the same way you would in a fascist system. So, I needed to be able to portray this. So as a writer in historical fiction, you can create an incident, but there has to be believability to it. So I hope it was a believable thing.
Well, it's interesting, because when you talk about in the forward, you actually mentioned how you changed your perspective of socialism before you were from home. One thing I also noticed is that you think it changed socialism and communism. Can you explain?
I've evolved a lot on this recently, and really what it comes down to is communism is a political system, and socialism is an economic system. And socialism has been practiced by lots of non-communist countries in one form or another, and to some extent. I think that personally, I think there's a certain fairness to some level of socialism, and this is just my opinion, not posing this on anyone, that I think is important overall. It's interesting. I was just in Argentina. We got back a week ago. So, and this is our second trip to Argentina. So Argentina has a very interesting history. And Peronism, which is sort of the bedrock, or the spine of the Argentine political culture, started out as a fascist system. But to make a very long story short, there are a lot of elements, economic elements that came from both left and right in Argentina in terms of that created the economic problem they have right now. Their currency collapsed. Basically because there's too much money chasing too few goods. And the reason for that is that there's wage supports, there's price supports and price limitations, and they also don't let anything into the country. You know, you can't, everything has to be made there. They're protecting their own industry. So as a result of this, every 20 or 25 years, their currency collapses. So the problem with the system is that they have a very, very good quality of life. As I mentioned, there are this coffee shops every 3 feet. You go out for dinner, and even with their economic problems, the cost of dinner is reasonable. That what you pay $30 there for a meal for 2 people is a $300 meal here. So, you know, they have a very good life. Rents are very low. All this is going to disappear if they change their system. If they adopt a more sort of common system that's used in capitalist societies, all this stuff is going to disappear. They're not going to have this quality of life. So when you ask me what's the difference, I think communism to me, in the way that I see it today, after the various books I've read, the research I've done, communism is a political system. And it is just another name for fascism. Socialism is economics.
You described beautifully the corruption on every level, before and after. So under Batista and under the Castro. And Moises kind of represents the character, or he's the pro Castro, thinks that he's turning over, coming up with a better system. It's really built out of ideology and perhaps a little bit of
100%.
of, you know, the other, you know, his little the Schmecker talking to with Ana Luis, right? But Ana Teresa rather. But then at the very end, there's this big blowout scene where he realizes when he goes to see Hector and he sees all the corruption and sees all the wealth being spent there. And then he has this change of heart. Was that based in fact? Do they have those conversations with his brother ever?
I am so glad that you asked me that question. So, okay, so for those of you who haven't read the book, it's a little bit of a spoiler, but you should read it anyway. So the fourth part of the book was a little problematic for me as a writer, because I never knew, and I never had the opportunity to speak to the Moises character, to Solomon, because he died in 2012. So I had to rely on interviews with people who knew him in order to understand him. So there was this big question as to whether or not, in the end, he still believed in this system that he had fought so hard for. And as I wrote that last portion, so as a writer, what you do is, after you have this first draft, which we call a readable draft, you put together a beta group. I have 2 beta groups. I have a beta group of readers, and I have a beta group of writers. So the writers all said the same thing to me, is that the obvious problem is that there's a lot of tension in the story through the first 3 sections. There's not so much tension in the last section when you're trying to tell this story of this guy who stayed, you know, what happened to him and what happened to his family. So I was looking for stuff. Now, my wife had this friend. I say had because they're no longer friends, who was a real interesting character. And she grew up on the east side of Manhattan. Her father was a doctor, and she grew up in the lap of luxury, and she went to Brearley, which is a very fancy, she went to school with Caroline Kennedy. Okay, she and Caroline, they were in the same class. So that's what we're talking about here. So she's a real pretentious kind of, you know, if any of you are watching, which I suggest you do, Capote versus, it's fantastic, okay? She grew up in that world. Okay, so she's at our house, and she begins telling me how she and her second husband visited Cuba, and that whole thing is based on her visit to Cuba.
So she was the American.
Right, she was the American. If she ever reads the book, she'll kill me. So, and she won't read it. So it's not her kind of book, you know, the book that about Truman Capote and the Swans, that's her kind. So I use this story to try to reflect on him and where his head would have been at that point. Because there's this period when that happens, which is called euphemistically the special period in Cuba in the 1990s, when basically they were starving and, you know, people were eating plastic in place of cheese. And at the same time, because I know when she was there, the same time, this American couple, you know, is invited by, and they really were invited by this artist, this Chilean artist, who was a friend of Castro's, and was, you know, the 40th anniversary of the revolution. She was busy creating murals for him. And they stayed in his estate, and they were bringing in lobsters and steak every night. And so I put Moises in the middle of this. See, so you can do that, you know, because it's still fiction. Yeah. But, you know, along that line, as I said, you know, the beauty of fiction, of historical fiction, is that it's the closest you can get to time travel. Because it puts you in the head of the character in a way that a history book, you know, which is just facts, or even a memoir, will not do. This puts you there, you're feeling what the character is feeling. So if I did my job correctly, you should feel his disgust at what he saw.
Another question, it's kind of funny one, did Che Guevara really smell as bad as you?
Apparently, there is a lot of stuff written about this. The guy he was not familiar with bathing.
He did not know hygiene.
No, he had terrible personal hygiene, so I figured, why not use it, you know?
So the other thing that I thought was interesting, and I think it just is pervasive, like propaganda was used throughout at every level. So Moises thinks that his view of the United States is the propaganda view, that they're the ones who are, because of the embargoes, that's why Cuba doesn't have a good economy. And then the other side of it is what the Americans view of Cuba. So can you talk a little bit about propaganda and how that was used? And
Okay, so it's used now, and it's used all the time, and it's used in everything. So it's funny because it was my favorite course in college. I took a course on propaganda. I loved it. So it's very easy, and I think Aaron makes this point in some conversation. It's very easy to blame everything on the Americans. The reason Cuba has problems is because of the United States. To some extent, that's true, but it's not the whole story. It's absolutely not the whole story. On the other hand, I wonder, after having done, you know, literally a year's worth of reading about this stuff, if we hadn't pushed so hard back against Castro, would he have ended up in the Soviet camp? Because Castro, you know, on the one hand, if it looks like a dog, it smells like a dog, and it runs with other dogs, it's a dog. But at the same time, there was so much pressure over American companies and their property that maybe if we had worked with him, maybe he wouldn't have ended up in the Soviet camp, because he did not proclaim himself to be a communist outright until 1962. That's 3 years after the revolution. So I have to question this. We as a people, and you know, I guess it's up to us as individuals to try to sift through it. We are presented with propaganda every single day from all kinds of directions, okay? And sometimes that propaganda is very intentional, and sometimes it's not necessarily intentional, it just makes a good story. So question becomes, you know, how do you sort of sift out the propaganda? I think, you know, and I hate to use this because it's a stupid expression, do your own research, you know. I think you have to be smart. I think you have to look at a situation and say, you know, well, what's really going on here? And what do I want to try to sift out? The same way at that time, you know, there was such terror in the idea that a communist state would exist 90 miles from Key West, And then certainly the Cuban Missile Crisis did not help.
Mhm.
All right, so propaganda is there all the time, and we're as guilty of it as they are.
Of course, well, that was what was interesting, because, and also when you had the end, when the tension between Moises and Aaron, each one of them was stuck in their view of the world.
Yeah.
But yet there was still this sense of family and this sense of love that was there in spite of the intractability of the way that they looked at it. It just seemed very reminiscent of where many families are today.
Let me comment about that whole confrontation with the two of them. First of all, it mostly happened. They didn't get to the punch throwing. That I added in because I needed a little drop. Okay, but this visit that occurred 40 years after they hadn't seen each other, 4 years, did not go well. Neither one of them was ever comfortable with the other. Now, I'll be, perfectly blunt. I have a sister, only one sister. Oil and water. I rarely see her. Just don't get along. I don't think that they were that different from that. I think there was always this mom liked you better thing going on. And they didn't have a lot of mutual respect for each other. I think there was a certain amount of, what's the right word? I think when faced with the prospect of either doing something to help or not, the family bond took over. Okay, so when in fact, and like I said, the incident in San Miguel did not happen, so Aron never got Moises out of jail. But when the time came that Aron needed Moises to help him get out of the country, Moises helped him. And everyone, other than Juan, is willing to say, yes, we think he helped. Because he would never admit that he did either, because he couldn't.
They were too stubborn.
Well, they were both stubborn, and there was a political issue. If anyone in Cuba found out that he had done something like that, he would be done. So it couldn't happen. I mean, even to this day, Miriam has relatives in Cuba, and I'm not kidding. The conversations are all being listened to. Things like, so the conversation ends up, oh, how are things? Okay, how's the weather? Good, it's beautiful here. The weather's, it's been 75 degrees every day. Oh, it's snowing here. That's the conversation. There's no real substantive conversation can be had when people are listening. So, I think that alternatively, all right, so there was a moment that actually happened, and it happened that day when the Trade Center was attacked, where Juan said to Solomon, Aaron said to Moises, he said, all these years later, and you still support this? You can't admit that this didn't work out, that this was a pipe dream? And that's when the argument really took heat. So, I feel badly for them because there was never, ever any resolution. So it's interesting in terms of the ending of the book. And my cousins will appreciate this more than anybody else in the book. So the last line of the book is, and they never spoke about it again. That was not the original ending. The original ending was a 2-page epilogue set in 2012 when Luz calls Aaron to tell him that Moises has died and that they buried him in the Patronato, in the cemetery. And he lights a Yortzeit candle for him and says, gosh. That's the Disney ending. And most readers like that better. So how did this ending happen? So as I told you, I have this beta group of writers. And I was talking before I wrote it, I was talking with one of them she's like a mentor to me. And I was saying, I'm not exactly sure how to end it, but I think it has to have a kind of noirish ending. And she said, yes, from what you're telling me, I think you're right. And then I was telling her, and I don't know if you're aware, this is a true story. When Uncle Max and Aunt Ilonka came from DR and they were living with my grandparents, my grandfather did not know all the details of what had happened to them in Europe and how they got out, etc., and what happened with the family. And my mother said to me, they went into what was then my uncle's room. They closed the door. My uncle David, my mother's brother, his room. They closed the door. They were in there for 2 hours. And they came out and Uncle Max told my grandfather everything. They came out and I said to my mom, what happened after that? She said they never spoke about it again. And that's the ending. So that ending didn't really apply to these two guys. It really was my grandfather and my uncle, but it was the perfect ending from a literary point of view. Okay, now readers, and I've even brought the ending to some of these things and had people read it and then tell me, well, which ending you like better? They're like, oh, I like this ending better. I'm like, that's because it's the Disney ending. Okay, but oh, I didn't even mention, so maybe, I don't know, I should tell you that, this actually was just shortlisted by Independent Press Awards. Yeah, yeah, so I'm very excited about that.
All right, well, I can keep going, but I'd like to open it up to the audience. Are there any questions that people have?
Yeah, you can ask me anything, yes.
First of all, I've been to Cuba before it shut down. Thanks, Randy. So I have been there, and one of the things that I loved about the book, and interesting to hear that you had never been there, was you visualized it very, very well in a lot of places for me. That Havana being the kind of city it is, you brought it, let's put it that
Thank you.
way. Okay. They revere Che
Yes, they do.
more than Fidel.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Wherever you go, Che is everywhere. And the most of the souvenirs they sell are berets. They're a very interesting mix of communism and socialism, because what's happening now is you have young people with telephones and computers, and they gather in places in the city where they can get a hot spot. Our hotel happened to be one of those, which was state-run, and Americans obviously can't be there anymore. The cities are lined with young people, and they're all trying to get online. So then COVID came. That changed the world, obviously. But I wonder what's going to happen, because there is a middle class developing in Cuba, coming back. People, the artisans are well known, the education level is very high. And with the internet, I just think it's going to be interesting to see what happens, because there are a real blend of socialism and communism. There are people living like in total poverty, and then there are mansions. And if you're a tourist, you can get shrimp and you can get lobster and you
That's-
can get all those
yeah.
things. Whereas the people that
can't.
live there can't. You use a different currency than they use when you're there. So there's still some big divides, but I think the internet's going to have a big impact because they're looking for it.
I would agree with you. So interesting along that line, that's how Miriam reconnected with the family. Because she has a cousin, or he passed away recently also. Her cousin Eduardo, who was around a little bit younger than her, they were both computer programmers, and he had a coveted email address. And he built a computer from scraps. It's interesting, like when I'm in the DR, they never throw anything out. They never throw, I mean, nothing. Every little piece of metal they save. Why? Because you never know when you need it to fix something. And Cuba's the same way. They just save everything and then they learn how to build things. And so, yes, I think you're right that with the internet, the same way that, what ultimately led to the downfall of communism in Eastern Europe was, the internet. That's really what it was. They say that, the way it says, that once the Russians saw what the Hungarians had, it was over. That was it. So I believe that will happen there too. The problem is in Cuba, I think is more one that's specifically political relative to the United States. So if Trump had not reversed this little bit of progress that was made with Obama, I think we would have seen a real change. The Castros are gone. All right, they're gone. Someone else is running the show now. They know that they can't continue this forever, but there's so much animosity with the United States that I think that goes completely past, what might bring some kind of change to the island. The other problem is that you have this entrenched community here, primarily in Miami, 3 generations down, and they're still carrying the keys to their houses. You know what? Listen, I understand. I understand it entirely. Okay. I just made a trip to Slovakia that required me to drive up a mountain to a village with 15 buildings so that I could see the house my grandfather was born in. All right, there's no reason why I should have any attachment to this place, but I do. The Cubans here cannot accept that, the party's over. And that's a big problem because Florida, and I don't really want to get political, Florida is a swing state. They vote almost uniformly Republican, along with the Venezuelans, who are the new Cubans. And, the Republican Party is going to keep that antipathy going because they want the votes. So I don't know. I think it happens eventually. I just don't know when. Something happens at some point. Yeah. Someone, another question?
Okay.
So I'm a Cuban Jew. I was
Ah.
born in Cuba,
See,
and you nailed that book.
thank you.
Really did, because you can ask my husband, like I had tears. Why?
Okay, then I did my
Because-
job. I love to hear that somebody
I tell you
cried. when they
why,
read my book.
because there's a story, everyone has a story, but it's all very similar. And I did have an uncle who never left, who sided with the Cuban government. And I did go back to Cuba, not Havana, Manzanillo. There were many other Cuban communities in Cuba besides Havana.
Right.
And I
Where were
went
you
to
from originally then?
Manzanillo. Cuba.
Montenegro.
And he said, so I went to visit him, I think 13 years later. He sided with communism. He was a math teacher. And when I went to visit him, he said, you know what? I regret my decision not to leave, but by then it was too late,
Right.
right? He was an old man. So, everything you said in that book, I know stories and stories and stories and stories about people. So I just loved your book. I just wanted to
Thank you.
tell you that you really nailed it.
I appreciate you saying that.
Yeah,
The thing is that, the sad truth is that the story of Cuban Jewry
Yeah.
becomes a footnote in the next generation.
Yeah.
It's like a story, it's like the story of so many of these Jewish communities, and particularly the ones in North Africa and where the Mizrahi Jews lived in the Middle East, where they were expelled. We know a lot about them. We know the history of it, but they're not there anymore. And, it's funny, how many Jews are there left in Cuba today? You hear anything from 300 to 1,200,
yeah,
and they're all old. So the tragedy is that this really vibrant and growing community was just cut off at the knees.
yeah. And the interesting thing is that my parents refused to talk about it, like.
That's not surprising.
No, yeah, it's not surprising, so.
Maybe they'll use it.
And actually, I know that one of the commentators of your book was Ruth Behar,
Yeah.
who's written a lot of books
Yes, she has. She's
About
sort of the
Cuban
doyen.
Jews, and she actually, for one of her books, she interviewed my uncle who was there, so it was very interesting, so
Thank
I
you.
really enjoyed your book.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
All right, well, it's 8:05. I don't know if we should. Yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
all right. Well, thank you. This was,
Can I say a few?
Of course.
Quick things.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you all for coming. Thank you for reading my book. Now, the question is, how can you help me? So here's how you could help me. Read my books. Recommend my books to your friends, neighbors, and relatives. Don't ever lend my book to anyone. Because if you lend my book, I do not earn a royalty. The other thing you could do for me, if you haven't, is please go on to Amazon and write a review. Amazon gauges, they promote your book relative to the number of reviews you have, how quickly, how consistently you get them. And then they recommend your book to people they think would be interested in it based on what they've been reading. So it's really, really critical to keep getting new reviews all the time. So if you could do that, it'd be great. Also, if any of you have book clubs or know people with book clubs, yeah, frankly, I do something a little different with small book clubs, like, 8, 10, 12 people. I will do Zooms with you. So, So, and I want to thank you all for coming. And yes,
Thoughts of a next book.
Oh, that was the other thing I want to tell you. So, okay, so after, all these books about communism and fascism and all this suffering, and I gotta tell you, so, there are nights that you want to kill yourself after you interview these people because the suffering is so terrible. I'm writing a book about baseball. Okay, and actually, I'm heading down to the DR, so I go to the DR every year. So, my best friend is Dominican, and he was born there, and he has a house down there, and he's there for the winter. So a few years ago, about 3 years ago now, his first cousin's son was signed by the Washington Nationals for $4 million. Now, $4 million to a Dominican family, I mean, it's incalculable how much that's worth to them. I mean, it's 20 generations who never have to worry about a thing. So I'm writing a book called Fielder's Choice. And it's a story of a young Dominican ball player who is a generational talent. He's a shortstop. And a sort of miserable former ne'er-do-well catcher whose father was a Holocaust survivor. And what happens, and it's set a little bit in the future because it's an expansion team. So it's set, 5 years from now, or 5 years from whenever you read it. So, and it's about their relationship and what happens, when at the end of this kid's contract, he has to be traded. And, I basically, I would like this to be my field of dreams, and I really want you to cry when you read this. Okay, so that's the next book. And then I have another book I'm working on, which is called Get Me Feldman, which is set in Florida in an old age home. Yes, it is a comedy, and Feldman was a criminal. So what's interesting about that is, I'm still kind of working on a lot of the details. The plot is actually an adaptation of Les Miserables, because you have this guy who's been parading around as somebody else for 25 years, and then the cop who's been chasing him realizes who he is, and it ties into the fact that I have so Mel. On that side, Mel is actually related to me. We found this out through ancestry. On that side, we have a cousin who his family, his whole sort of going back a couple generations, they were gangsters. Okay. And so I recently reconnected with their grandson, with the grandson who's, my second cousin. And I saw him when we were in Florida. And I'm, sort of going to try to use some of their story in that as well. Yeah, it's interesting stuff.
Look forward to reading it.
Thank you.
Good things coming. And thank you for sharing your story with us tonight.
My pleasure.
And thank you, Lisa.
If anybody wants me to sign a book,
If you've read the books, it makes a nice gift to come buy a signed book for someone else. And if you have yet to read the book, come check it out. AJ is here signing, and please enjoy some Cuban tres leches cake. Did I say it right? Thank you all.